Season 18 is finally here and there have been some pretty significant weapon changes, so it is time for a newly updated weapon tier list. And just keep in mind, as always, we won't go over the care package guns because they are obviously S tier. I think we all know how good they are. But first, if you do want to improve faster and get more in-depth guides, make sure to head over to the GameLeap website where we have literally hundreds of guides to help you improve faster. Guides covering fundamentals, advanced movement techniques, advanced legend tutorials, gameplay breakdowns, legend abilities, legend strategies, and so much more. We spend a lot of time and do our best to give full analytical breakdowns that will actually help you in whatever goal it is you have in the game. So if you actually want to learn faster and become insane at the game, I highly recommend you join the GameLeap family to get instant access to all of these in-depth guides by checking out the link in the description below. First up, really quick, let's just get this out of the way. You already know what's in D tier. We got the RE45 and of course we have the P2020. Both of these guns can be fun to use, especially when hammer points are involved. However, fun doesn't necessarily mean meta. The problem is that they both require a pretty rare attachment for it to even come remotely close to an SMG's performance. That said, it's extremely hard to justify putting them any higher on this list. So even though, yes, they can be fun, D is where they will stay. All right, on to C tier, the Devotion, then the Rampage, and finally we have the Spitfire sitting at the top of C tier. Quite frankly, LMGs are in a bit of a rough spot in general. The issue with them is that they just don't put out enough damage, even though they are easy to use, and the Devotion's put out is pretty good, but it's difficult to use and needs up a ton of ammo and requires a hop up. The main benefit of LMGs is that they have a very high damage per magazine, allowing you to either kill multiple targets with a single mag easier. However, that means that you are relying on people missing their shots, which is never a guarantee, and you will always lose to someone who is using an AR or an SMG if they have better aim. So really, you're just better off using an assault rifle, and that way you're having the best of all worlds. Decent damage, decent mobility, and decent handling. And yes, I know they buffed the Spitfire, but all they did was slightly buff its recoil, which isn't really the problem with the gun in the first place. It's already easy to control, but its damage output is just too poor to really justify using it over something like a flatline. It may be something that you use as an oppressive weapon at range, sort of how you used to use the charge rifle before the nerf, but really overall there are better options for ranged weapons as a whole, like the Nemesis. Alright, on to B tier, and here we've got the Havoc. This gun just isn't quite as good as it used to be. If you are good at jitter aiming and are good at timing the charge with a peek, then you can get a lot of value out of this gun. But since it's not the easiest to use and the nerf to the turbocharger taking it down a peg, you're probably better off with a different AR that takes less work to do the same, if not more damage. Alright, next up we've got the Cringe Rifle, which after its rework, it's receiving its will not be as cringe, thankfully. In fact, this thing is low-key kind of cheeks. The damage is low for the average distance that you are going to be using it at, because when are you going to be using a non-hit scan weapon from 300 meters away? You're not. And if you are, you're probably doing it wrong. Plus, it's not nearly as easy to use as before, and you might be surprised at how much you'll miss with this thing. You're much better off with any of the other sniper or marksman rifles, I promise you. Now we've got the Mozam Cheeks. This is actually a very fun gun to use, especially when you have all the attachments, and it can be very good without the attachments as well. However, again, it isn't the easiest weapon to use, and it simply doesn't compare to other shotguns in terms of one burst potential, which is really what shotguns are for. I will say though, if you are a Maggie main, this weapon is A tier, as it does grant you full stray speed, which is insane if you can hit your shots. Next up is the Volt. SMG's got some nerfs this season, so that's one factor as to why it's a bit lower on the list this time around, but the other reason is because the alternator being able to use disruptor rounds now. Mathematically, the alternator with disruptor rounds on a target with max armor and damaging them through their normal health all the way to 0 makes its damage output about the same as the Volt, roughly around 180 DPS. Except with the alternator, you get better hipfire and significantly higher damage per magazine. So while this gun still works well as a high mobility AR substitute, the Volt really is behind when it comes to the SMG category. Now it's on to the next weapon, the 3030. Normally I would put this higher on the list, but the more I think about it, I think this gun is just generally more difficult for a majority of players players to use. A lot of the time, players make the mistake of relying too much on the charge mechanic when really you should be treating it more like a wingman. If you are relying on the charge mechanic, then the longbow is probably a better option for you anyway, as it has a faster fire rate for roughly the same damage unless you time the 30-30's charge to be immediately after the second tick, which is a lot of brain work for not as much payoff as I think you should get. The gun can be pretty forgiving since it has a faster fire rate than most snipers, but that also means you need to hit more shots compared to other snipers. The reload is annoying, though it can be used to your advantage by loading one then taking a shot compared to trying to reload the entire thing, which takes forever. But again, this just all requires so much mental power compared to a normal weapon. And as much as I enjoy the gun, it seems to fall a little behind in the ease of use department these days. Alright, on to the Sentinel. This is a gun that is very fun to use since it's the only ground loot bolt action sniper and it does a ton of damage when charged with a shield cell. Normally, I would have put this gun ahead of the longbow because of its passive mechanics giving it similar fire rate but with much higher damage. However, the tempo mechanic adds a layer of complexity to it, and even though you don't have to hit shots to get the benefit, it encourages a shoot without actually aiming type of mentality. Plus, it can be resource draining overall due to requiring a shield cell to get the boost in damage, so on paper, I'd say it's better than the longbow, but in reality, it's probably not as good for the average player. But if you aim really good and you don't mind using up your shield cells, then it is definitely the better option. Next up, we've got the longbow. I always say this gun feels clunky, and that's because it is. However, overall, it's most likely going to be a much easier experience for the average player to use and get value out of compared to the previous snipers. It doesn't have any strange mechanics, and its fire rate can help with consistency in your shot, as well as it having decent amount of damage. Nothing crazy, but good enough. Finally, at the top of B tier, we have the Hemlock. Now, I had a hard time placing this one because this gun actually received a damage buff compared to its pre-care package version. It does a good chunk of damage, that being 22 per bullet compared to its previous 20. Doesn't sound like a big difference, but I assure you it is. It only took a 1 damage increase for the R99 for it to go from B tier to S tier, so yeah, keep that in mind. However, they also increased the recoil, and you can certainly feel it when it comes to the Hemlock. Not to mention, the time between bursts is slower than the Nemesis, so it can make the gun punishing if you start to miss bullets. Overall, the gun is still not in the greatest shape, and you are likely to be better off taking one of the other assault rifles, mainly for consistency purposes. Alright, now on to A tier, and first up is the Alternator. With disruptor rounds on an armored target, this gun does roughly 190 DPS, which is lower than the car but higher than the flatline. Its DPS drops to 160 on a target without armor. With that said, it now has a ton of damage per magazine considering that it's an SMG. After the math is said and done, on a full armored target all the way through damaging them without armor, the Alternator has about 468 damage per magazine. 240 of that damage is the 15 bullets left over after you break their armor, so this gun has enough damage to kill 2 red armored players. Perhaps if you like to play more aggressive and want to be in close range a majority of the time with a double SMG setup or an SMG shotgun setup, this would be a great main hand replacement for your AR. Just keep in mind its bullet velocity is slow, so it might not be the best for longer range fights compared to something like the Volt. Next up is the Triple Take. Overall, I do think this gun is pretty balanced for what it is. It works decently well as a shotgun, though you lose movement speed and damage compared to something like a PK. It also is pretty consistent and easy to use for long ranges, making it a pretty versatile gun with decent damage, and really that's what makes a gun good. Versatility combined with damage plus ease of use. Next, we've got the Car SMG. This gun can be incredibly versatile due to its special ammo mechanic, and it still does a ton of damage even though it's not as much as the R99. Honestly, it's always a great close range option, and even though the R99 did get a nerf, the Car is still a bit more difficult to control, or is at least kind of similar to the R99, and it does less damage, so it's kind of like, well, you might as well just take the R99. The damage per mag difference is, honestly, it's negligible, but I think overall the car is still a good pick. It's just not as good as the R99. Next up is the Mastiff and EVA 8. Overall, both shotguns are good. The Mastiff got a buff to its spread, making it much tighter. I'd say it's probably going to be much more consistent for most players, regardless if you actually notice it or not. The EVA 8 had nothing changed with this season, but it's still a good option. However, the PK with disruptive rounds does really high burst that these two weapons simply cannot hit at the moment, which is why they remain in A tier. Finally, we've got the G7. It has a very high ammo capacity for a marksman rifle and has the fastest fire rate as well. It's easy to use, uses the most common ammo type, and is extremely forgiving. It does a lot of damage quickly when hitting those successive shots, so it yet again easily sits at the top of A tier for Season 18. And of course, next up is the R99. Yes, I know it was nerfed. Does it matter? No, not really. The recoil was nerfed, but only vertically, which is good because horizontal recoil is the one that's difficult to control, not taking aim smoothing into account, which technically was nerfed for SMG since you now strafe slower. Just a little fun fact for you guys, though the difference really is not noticeable at all. Also, it's still pretty easy to control, and players who have been using the gun should not have much issue and likely won't see much of a difference in terms of results. Maybe just a little bit of practice and it'll be back to normal, one beaming people. As for the max mag nerf, it still does 312 damage to the body compared to its previous 324, which I remind you, before the R99 got its buffs and became all S tier and whatnot, it was only 298 that it did as its max damage per magazine. So we're still ahead of the game. But really, it's not that much of a difference overall. Its DPS is still insanely high, so it's hard putting it anywhere else besides S tier. Next up, we've got the PK. This gun with disruptive rounds is pretty crazy, basically allowing you to hit a player in the body for 121 damage, which is a lot. However, it's not a 2-tap like you might think. It still takes 3 shots to kill with the PK, so that is something you need to keep in mind, but overall, the disruptor rounds are a really nice addition to the PK toolkit. Next up, we have the R301. It's still ridiculously easy to use while having a decent amount of damage output, being only slightly behind the flatline. However, it does fall behind the flatline statistically, and this is a good weapon to grab always, and it's very beginner friendly while still having a decent amount of damage, therefore it remains an S tier. Next up is the flatline. While this gun is harder to control than the R301, on paper it is better than it in almost every way. Higher damage per magazine, higher damage per second, and though it's harder to use than the R301, it's still pretty easy all things considered. With a little practice, this is definitely the weapon to go with if you are still deciding on this or the R301, but if you just really like the consistency of the R301, well then, I mean, you know, then you can do that. That's up to you. But of course, none of the ARs compare to the Nemesis. It still has the highest DPS out of the full auto ARs, and it's super easy to use. It falls behind a bit in close range because its hipfire is so horrible, making it less versatile overall, but it's incredibly strong when used where it's supposed to be, which is those mid to long ranges. And as far as ARs go, really you don't have to look any further, just pick the Nemesis. And of course, you can't forget the Wingman. We all love it, we all mess with it, so in reality we all probably actually hate it. But there is no denying its raw versatility and power. If you can hit your shots, this is one of, if not the best gun in the game. If you can't hit your shots, well then therapy may be in order. Regardless, it is a very good gun, and again, S tier for this season. Anyway, what did you think of this list? Do you agree? Let us know in the comments below. Okay, love you, bye.